So I know normally you're used to seeing people on the stage and kind of seeing how their movements work and things like that. Like Tomas, we had an amazing dance earlier. But we live in the 21st century, and so we happen to have an amazing speaker who is unfortunately not able to be here physically. He's going to be here virtually. So we're going to do this amazing talk. It's going to be a live stream to Silicon Valley. And we're going to talk to you about prototyping for impact and how the world is connected. And we're going to have an amazing speaker called Tom Chi, founder of Google X, or co-founder of Google X, and he's going to talk to us about that. And we have an amazing moderator. I cannot speak as highly as she is recommended. Karena, Belin, co-founder and CEO of WHub and AngelHub. So welcome to the stage, Karena, and we'll get Tom Chi on the screen at some point. You can grab that.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Tom, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Fantastic. We can hear you very well. I am really thrilled to have you here with us, at least virtually in Hong Kong. We met 3 years ago when I had the absolute honor to join one of your rapid prototyping workshops. And since ever then, I dreamt about bringing you back to Hong Kong, to the ecosystem, and to share some of your amazing experiences that started with Google X and Google Glasses, right, in terms of prototyping, but then you brought it to a totally next level. So I'll leave the stage to you, and thank you very much for sharing.
All right, no problem. So it actually started a lot before Google Glass, but I talk about these examples because I was one of the founding team members of Google X, and people are interested in Google X, like the self-driving cars and Glass and the Project Loon, all those sorts of things. But yes, about taking it to the next level, definitely didn't stop with just using this for hardware. These sorts of lessons of being able to go quickly prototype and iterate and improve things. I've spent actually a lot of time in like the social entrepreneurship and social good sectors applying them. And this talk is going to touch on a little bit of that. Before we get there, let's talk and just get the basics down around what rapid prototyping is. So, as mentioned, I was one of the founding team members of Google X. When I joined, we just had 8 people, and we hadn't created the car yet or the glass. All the different things that you may or may not have heard about Google X, none of those things were created yet. But we did have a meeting about where we got a simple brief from the founders of Google, Larry Page and Sergey Brin. And the brief was basically kind of a big ambitious challenge. And it's actually not the ones that you guys are looking at today, because you guys are looking at what are some of these big problems that we can solve for the Hong Kong ecosystem. But for this particular project, the brief that we had, it was just 8 sentences long. And the very first sentence said, imagine that Google was in your brain, which actually sounds kind of terrifying and bad, but luckily there's a couple more sentences. And the other 7 sentences said something like, well, right now Google is a web service that you access through a browser that you need to pull up the browser on a device, and that device, whether it's a phone or laptop or desktop, you typically log into. So really, the time between you wanting to know something and you being able to use Google to know it, there's like these 4 or 5 steps in the way. And we kind of imagine at some point in the future that it'll be possible for people to just instantly know things as soon as they'd like to know them. And then the very last sentence said, let's realize this in less than 5 years. So our team kind of sat down and we started brainstorming, and pretty quickly we started coming up with ideas like, oh, well, let's build a heads-up display, or let's go build a contact lens, or let's go build a new artificial intelligence and voice recognition technology that will allow us to go and interact with devices in ways that are faster than the ways that are currently possible to interact with Google. And this brainstorm, really productive, really exciting. And you'll notice, though, that when we're saying, hey, let's go build a heads-up display, building a heads-up display is not necessarily the same thing as instantly knowing everything that you want to as soon as you would like to know it. But it is something that's on trajectory to. So it's on the path toward the world where you're able to do that. And whenever you're trying to go for something that's very ambitious, something that's like a huge moonshot, then it is helpful to go come up with the kinds of projects that are on trajectory too. So, another example from Silicon Valley, Elon Musk has talked about, wanting to make a multiplanetary civilization, so colonizing Mars. But, his very first project isn't to go send a bunch of things to Mars. The very first project is on the trajectory, it's on the path to getting there, which says, well, let's make a company, SpaceX, which can go launch rockets, recover them, launch them again, so that we can dramatically reduce the cost of getting matter up into orbit. And once you're in orbit, it's a lot cheaper to get from orbit to outside of the Earth's orbit. Anyhow, that first meeting, we decided a couple possible things that we could do in order to go and build that trajectory toward a world where we would instantly know things as soon as we'd want to know them. And one of those things was making a heads-up display. And we talked about it that morning, but we ultimately ended up in some big argument about what color the heads-up display should be. Like, what color should the light be that comes through the heads-up display? And when I left the room that day, I felt very dissatisfied that we were having this type of argument. I said, well, arguing about things, talking about things is not the right way for us to solve these problems. I mean, I could tell just because we spent the whole morning arguing about it, and we basically made no progress. I said, well, what if we apply this prototyping approach instead? How could we learn about this by applying the prototyping approach? And the question that you see on the screen is a question to go ponder. If you needed to go build the heads-up display so you could have information floating in front of you as you walked around, and any kind of digital information floating in front of you as you walked around, how would you do it? How long do you think it would take?
I don't know. Do you want to have a guess?
Interactive.
Yeah, I guess.
And then, just think in your mind. You don't need to say it out loud.
Okay.
But I will now tell you the answer. So, do you have a thought in your mind? Okay, good. So, the answer was just a couple hours, and this is the second prototype of Google Glass, not the first one. So our meeting was in the morning. I actually built the first prototype of Google Glass before lunch, and then this is the second prototype that was built just after lunch. And what it is there's a coat hanger that is hanging around the neck, and then the other end of the coat hanger is in a little spiral resting on the sternum. And that coat hanger allows you to hold a clear piece of plexiglass in front of you. And at the end of that plexiglass, and the plexiglass you can see through, so it doesn't really block your vision. And then at the end of the plexiglass is a little sheet projector, which allows you to go project an image onto it, but still be able to go see through the sheet easily. So you can walk around without the screen itself blocking your view. And then at the base of the plexiglass is a small projector, so anything that you can go put onto a computer, you can have floating in front of you. So the very first thing that we did was to go and write a paragraph of text and put it in every color of the rainbow. And in a very short amount of time, the issue that we argued about for close to an hour in the morning was settled in 90 seconds just by having the direct experience. And this is one of those key points about prototyping. We don't prototype just because it's fun or it's good practice for engineering, all that sort of thing. Though, it is fun and it is good practice for engineering, but that's not the reason we do it. The reason that we prototype is when we make decisions using our guesses, then we're very often wrong and it's very often a slow process. But when we make decisions using the direct experience of something that we've created, then it's actually a very fast process. Like in this particular case, we were trying to go figure out what color of light should be coming through the heads-up display. And once you're actually able to experience it, it's very clear which colors of light work well and which colors work terribly. And work terribly in this case means really hard to read, uncomfortable to look at, that kind of thing. Great. Now, underpinning all of this is a really fundamental idea, which is the purpose of the prototyping process. Instead of trying to be right, instead of trying to go guess the right answer and argue with other people that you're right, you instead try to maximize the rate of learning. What does it look like when you take that same mantra? How do you go minimize the time to try new ideas when you're raising investment? So this example comes from the Unreasonable Institute pitch event. And similar to a lot of entrepreneur investor type pitch events, they basically had an event where the entrepreneurs would get on stage, investors could come up and talk with them, express interest in investing or not, and then go further with that team to go pursue or due diligence on that investment if it was interesting. Now, the year before I worked with Unreasonable, they basically ran an event like this, but it ended up not being that effective. So they pulled me in to try to improve things. And if you look over on the right-hand side, this is the way that a typical investor-entrepreneur meeting goes. So here's the entrepreneur with the blue brain, and they're like, hey, why don't you help me out with $1 million? And here's the investor with the green brain, and then the investor is like, well, how about no? And then that happens, 20, 50 times before eventually some investor says, yeah, sure, maybe. But what ends up happening then is you spend a lot of time going to different meetings, trying to go learn what you need to learn in order to make your company investable. So instead of doing that format, which is also the format that happens after a typical pitch event, we decided to go follow that principle of how do you reduce the time to try? And we changed the format so that instead of having these one-on-one meetings, what happened was the investors did their pitches, the entrepreneurs did their pitches in front of all the investors. And the investors had these little cards where they could go, put a little X next to the names of the companies that they wanted to learn a little bit more about. Then after all the pitches were done, we had them go stand under, a sign because we had one sign for all the different companies that were there. We had them go stand under a sign, and then the entrepreneur was there. But instead of doing just the typical diligence, I said, here's the task for the next hour. In the next hour, you guys are a bunch of investors coming to go see these companies, but for the next hour, you are not going to be investors. For the next hour, you are going to pretend to be the board of directors of the entrepreneur that you're standing right next to. And your goal within the next hour is to work with them to make them the most investable company that they can possibly be. And this tiny tweak actually completely changed how fast it was for the entrepreneur to go try different ideas. Because instead of going through the whole 20-slide pitch and then having the investor, just shoot off a couple questions before the meeting ends without really learning very much, if these folks were on the board of directors, they don't wait until you get to the end of the pitch in order to help you improve your what you're talking about. If on slide 3 there's some important thing that would help your company be more investable, they would instantly chime in, and they had multiple investors, chiming in because each entrepreneur was paired up with 4 or 5 investors, or in a group of 4 to 5 investors. Now, what were the results by kind of reducing that time to try? Well, in the year before I worked with them, they actually did this huge pitch event, but ultimately there were conversations, but there was 0% of companies that ended up going into serious diligence for investment. In the year that we did this format, it jumped up to 90%. And we had feedback from the entrepreneurs that said that they made more than 3 months of investment progress in a single day. And it's really simple. Like normally if you want to get feedback from one investor, you drive to their office or you set up a lunch meeting, and maybe you have 2 of those meetings per day or 3 of those meetings per day when you're actively fundraising. And sometimes they'll tell you what they really think about your company. A lot of times they'll just be like, it was good meeting you, and they won't take the time. And be getting maybe 1 or 2 interesting pieces of feedback per day. But when you actually have the folks pretend to be your board of directors and work in this far more interactive way, they had 4 or 5 investors giving them a new piece of feedback basically every minute. And when you end up getting like a new piece of feedback every minute, as opposed to, one or two pieces of feedback per day, then the time to go try different ideas shrinks a lot, and your rate of learning goes up by close to a factor of 100. All right, we're going to move on to another example, other social impact example. So what would it look like to go maximize the rate of learning by reducing the time to try if you were serving an underserved community? And in this case, the work was happening in Aguascalientes, Mexico, where there's a significant community that lives on just $1 or $2 per day. And to give you a sense, if you look in the bottom left right there, that's one of the houses in the community. That family lives on less than $1 a day. And there's hundreds of homes that were like this. Now, let's look at that prototyping principle, and let's talk about how we can apply it here. So what happened in this engagement is the previous day we went around the community and we just sat with people and interviewed them and tried to understand their life. But then on the second day, we actually got into the prototyping. And remember, we're trying to reduce that time to try. So, and the goal for the day was to go come up with innovative business models that could help this community. So the way that we set up this experiment is what I call the home team, away team approach to rapid prototyping. So it looked like something like what you see over on the right-hand side. At the edge of the community, there was a community center. And in the community center, we had a handful of home teams. And every home team had exactly 2 away teams that were assigned to them. And basically, the away teams would be out in the community, and then the home teams were in the community center at home. With this setup, what I requested of each team is I basically said, okay, everybody, all the home teams, you have exactly 15 minutes to go come up with a business model that could potentially help, people that you met in the community yesterday. And that sounds maybe already pretty ambitious, but I let them know that a business model doesn't need to be anything complicated. It's just a way that people are able to do things in order to support each other, such that the thing is financially self-sustaining. That's it. And with that, I'll give you an example of some of the things that happen. So for example, a handful of the folks from the previous day had gone to a carpenter's house, and they spent some time with the carpenter, and the carpenter felt a little bit distressed, maybe a little bit depressed, because he was clearly a good carpenter. Like, his house was better built than a lot of the other houses, and he built it himself. And a lot of the interior things in his house were really well built, so he definitely had the skills. But he was complaining to the students, well, I feel like I'm a good carpenter, but who comes to the outskirts of town into a poor neighborhood or poor community in order to go find a carpenter? I have these skills, but I can't get work. So these students basically said, well, why don't we make a simple business model where they drew a stick figure and they said, well, imagine there's the carpenter over here, and then last week the carpenter could go teach young men and boys from the community carpentry skills so that he's able to get that income from working with them. And so they just kind of drew the stick figure of the carpenter, they drew the stick figure of these folks, and they say, well, if each one of them pays like 10 pesos or something reasonable in order to get these lessons, then maybe this will be interesting to the carpenter. Now, this is just the business model drawing part of it, and remember, they only had like 15 minutes to do that. As soon as that was done, I said, okay, what I want you to do is call your away teams. And I want your away teams to go find the people that would need to participate in that business model and ask them about it. So you can see this is the home team right here. They've got their multiple away teams on speakerphone, so they're able to be in continuous contact. And here's one of their business model drawings. So in this particular case, one of their away teams went back to the carpenter's house and showed them the business model. And as they were showing the business model, the carpenter started nodding and getting really excited. And he said, "Hey, wow, this is amazing! Like, if I could if I could get even 8 or 10 students, this might triple my income. So he was extremely excited by this. And in a way, like for that away team, they could put a big check mark that this was a business model that the carpenter would be excited by. The other away team went to go find some teenage boys that might be the right customers to learn these carpentry lessons. And they eventually found some boys playing soccer. And the away team didn't have a huge amount of time. They had 20 minutes to go get this feedback. So they found the boys playing soccer, showed them the business model, and the boys were kind of like, yeah, this is okay. I mean, carpentry is a good skill, and that seems like a reasonably good price. So things seem to be going pretty well. But then all of a sudden, one of the boys, in the crowd shouted out, but what we really want to learn is how to build cars and motorcycles. And then all of a sudden, all the boys like erupted into cheering, because like every single one of them like was insanely excited about doing that. So remember, the home team is getting all this feedback live. And when I stopped by that home team and I heard that feedback, I was like, okay, well, it sounds like you need to find a mechanic. So we called the group that was with the carpenter and we said, hey, you need to excuse yourself and we need you to go into town and find a mechanic. And luckily it was a small community, so after knocking on a few doors and asking if anybody knew a mechanic, then they got the directions to the mechanic's house. They walked over to the mechanic, showed him the same business model, but like in this case, the boys learning kind of the skills on how to service cars and motorcycles. And the mechanic's looking at it and he's nodding his head and he's like, wow, you're telling me that there's already boys that want to learn this skill? And I'm like, yeah, for sure, we just met them. It's like, and they would pay this much. It's like, yeah, no, we just talked with them about this. And the mechanic starts, nodding and getting excited, and it's like, well, this, if this really happened, this might even double my income. This is very exciting. And he starts like kind of building in his head like the different things that he would start teaching. But all of a sudden he stops and he's like, oh, no, I just realized something. This can't work. And then the team asks him, well, what's going on? He's like, well, the problem is that, let's say I'm teaching 10, 15 people. We don't have enough cars and motorcycles for them to work on. Like I only have my one motorcycle that I need to get into town with, or I might have a single, client's car or motorcycle. So I can't really have the kids messing that up. I don't be enough vehicles for them to learn on. And as soon as the home team heard that, they called the other home team and they said, we need you to find people that have broken down vehicles in their front yard. And then they started to go knock on doors, and in a very short span, they found a lot of people that were willing to go and bring their vehicles over in order to improve the condition by having the mechanic and his students work on them and learn from them. And the long story short, our home teams, in the span of just 3 hours, on average, each team iterated their business model 8 different times. And by the end of 3 hours, we had multiple people, like we had almost a dozen people coming in from the community, excited to go work on these businesses together. And this didn't come from like some external aid or some huge funding. This was basically using entrepreneurship in order to go create new nascent opportunities just by doing this rapid iteration and verifying ways that people can really serve each other. All right, so that was very quick. We talked about how we could use rapid prototyping in a couple different things for social good. And I'd love to be able to go and take a quick question before you guys move on with the day.